Right, you're in 1 Peter chapter 2, and we'll be reading verses 18 down to 21 here in just a moment. We've spent 2 weeks in a section here dealing with our relationship as Christians to the government. How do we respond? How do we relate to the government as Christian citizens? And I trust it's been helpful. I trust it's been encouraging. There's a lot more we could say. I almost thought about just trying to take another message on that topic as we're approaching the election, but I think to move forward in the text is going to be beneficial for us today. But as we do move forward, let me encourage you to continue to do your part. Let me encourage you to stay engaged in the process. Continue to if you haven't voted yet, do it. Get out there and get your vote in place. It's important to be part of this. I would encourage you also to pray. That is our primary weapon. Spend time in prayer. We talked about that at the end of the message last week. Seek God's face. Ask Him for mercy. And then I would also close this idea with this thought is that we need to determine, no matter what happens, and not just for this election cycle, but as we look ahead to the next and to the next, determine that you will choose both to fear God and to honor the King. That's the principle that we saw at the end there of 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 17. Well, Peter now is moving on to a different relationship. From the relationship of Christians in government to the relationship between servants or slaves and masters. Now, I realize, I'm not super astute historically, but I do realize that in America, slavery has been abolished, and that happened a long time ago. I understand that. I also understand that none of us have been involved in servant-master, servant-slave relationships, right? That's before our time. Now, there may be some of us that have worked for somebody that we called a slave driver. That may have come up at times, and I'm sure we can all relate to that type of an idea, but we've never been involved in that relationship. So for us, the application is going to be a little bit different. Some of what Peter says here really does apply directly to his audience there in that first century. But there are applications that we'll be able to draw to our employee-employer relationships here as well. And that's our goal here as we work through that today. What does our relationship look like in that work environment? How do we demonstrate this beautiful life that Peter talks about here? How do we do that in the workplace? What does that look like? Now, with that preface, some of you may be thinking to yourself, Pastor, have you looked at the average age of your congregation lately? Do you realize that most of us are no longer in the workforce? We're not actively employed at that perspective. You might even be thinking to yourself, man, some of us are old enough to actually remember where we were when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. I'm not sure if there's anybody quite at that stage. If you were, then I want to shake your hand. You've been around a long time. Some of you are thinking, man, a 4-hour shift as a greeter at Walmart would probably do me in. I'm not really able to be in the workforce anymore. The only boss that I answer to is my wife, and I say, yes, ma'am, right? And maybe some of you are in that position. And by the way, if that's you, that can be a really good response or a really bad response, depending on your inflection. So let me encourage you, if you do respond that way, use the correct inflection in your voice. That might make all the difference. Point taken. I realize as I look at this group that many of you are not in the workforce, but I also realize that many of you are. And those of you that aren't, I think there's still application here as well, because you have children and you have grandchildren that are still in the workforce. And they may come to you at some point and say, hey, I'm struggling with this, and talk about a situation that's going on at work. And you can use these principles and others from the Word of God and from your experience to counsel them, to help give them wisdom and guidance in that area. All joking aside, there is something about this generation that understands work. You guys have got that right. You guys, in your lives, as you look at, you've endured some hard situations. You've worked hard your whole lives. Many of you have worked at hard, difficult, unpleasant jobs even, and you've borne up under the weight of that. Some of you have had some real difficulties in your work environment. But this idea of hard work and the benefits that come from it, this generation here can pass that down to the next generation and to the generation after them. And so that would be my encouragement to you as you listen to this message today. If you don't feel it applies to you directly, find ways to use this in the lives of other people that you might be able to impact. The younger generation needs to understand the value of hard work, doesn't it? And that's an important part. Well, let's look at this text here today. Let's look at verse 18, and we're going to focus down to verse 20, but we'll include 21 in our reading here this morning. Here's what Peter says. Servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward. For this is thankworthy, if a man for conscience toward God endure grief, suffering wrongfully. For what glory is it when you be buffeted for your faults, you take it patiently? But if when you do well and suffer for it, you take it patiently, this is acceptable with God. For even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that ye should follow his steps. We titled the message today of Servants and Masters. And we're going to break it down into a couple of main thoughts here, and then really the next several verses, down and even through verse 25, I think coordinate with this passage and explain a little more fully what he's talking about. But he's dealing with submission in the workplace. He's dealing with the suffering that may happen through submission in the workplace. So our first point is going to be this: submissive servants fulfill God's expectation. When we are submissive in the work environment, it fulfills the expectation of God. Just as God desires a Christian citizen to submit to his government, so he expects a Christian worker to submit, to be in submission to his boss. And that's the perspective here. And so let's work down through this verse 18, and just kind of take it a word or a phrase at a time. He begins with servants. And in so doing, he uses a broad address. He's addressing a broad audience here. Those of you that have been in church most of your lives, you're probably already thinking of a word that he may have used here for servant or slave. The word doulos may come to your mind. It's kind of a bond slave, a bond servant. And that's what I thought at first too, but that's not the word that he chose to use. The word that he uses is the word oikotes, and it's from the word oikos, which means house. And so the idea here is he's referring to a domestic servant or slave, someone who is a household servant. One who lives in the same house and therefore found himself under the authority of the householder. You say, well, Pastor Mark, why is that significant? Well, for a number of reasons. One, this is a word that covered every single reason for servitude. You think back to the culture in which Peter is writing, there's a number of ways somebody could find themselves as a slave or as a servant. It could be that they were taken captive in a military campaign. Wars in those days were ugly, ugly things. Either you were killed in the battle or you were taken a slave if you lost in that battle. And so many were taken and became slaves because of that. Others were purchased at the slave market. It's a brutal thought. It's an interesting concept, but not something that we have to face today, and I'm thankful for that. It's possible that this person could be a servant that is working for wages within that household. The term would apply to that type of an idea as well. It also could apply to someone who was born a servant within that home. Two servants were there. They have a child. The servant now is born into that home. He's growing up as a servant or slave within that context. So it covers every reason for servitude. It also is a word that covers every occupation of service. When you think of a slave, what's the picture that comes to your mind? Someone performing menial labor. I mean, in our American history, we're thinking of somebody in the cotton fields. That's the mental image, at least that I have. And this term could apply to that. It applies to those that work the fields, but it also applied to those that cooked the food, those that kept the house, those that treated the sick, those that taught the children, accounted for the money, provided entertainment. It's a term that covers all of these. So oikotes could apply equally to a dishwasher as it could to a doctor. Households employed their own doctors at times during this age. It could apply to a laborer just as well as to an accountant, or to a cook just as well as to a teacher. What we would consider maybe more the blue collar as well as the white collar. And so in using this word, what Peter is doing is he's eliminating every possibility of somebody saying, well, that doesn't apply to me. All right, that's really good for you to have to submit in this situation, but I don't have to because whatever. But Peter, using this word, he eliminates that possibility. But I also think in so doing, he opens up the door of application for us today. No, we don't have servant-slave relationships. But our employee and our employer relationships certainly fit within the parameters of this text because of the word that Peter uses here for servants. So we see this broad address. Secondly, we see a direct command. What does he say? Servants, be subject to your masters. And we've looked at this word quite extensively over the past 2 weeks, so let's just remind ourselves briefly of the definition. It means to arrange myself under a God-given authority with humility and respect. That's what the word means, to rank under. It's a military word. And so I place myself under, I submit to that leadership. It's something I do continuously. It's in the present tense here, just like it was earlier. I don't find exceptions there, but I also do it voluntarily. I don't force my boss in this situation to make me submit, to bring me into that point of submission. I don't rear my head back and force him to do that. I do it voluntarily. I do it willingly. Well, I think for us, as just as well as them in that day, this would be a challenging concept. Our old nature tends to push back against this idea of submission, doesn't it? Of ranking myself under. And we see that here even in the passage. He says, servants, submit to your masters. The word that he uses here is despotes. It means one who exercises absolute authority and control over his domain. And it doesn't matter if it's a king reigning over his subjects, or like in this passage, a householder reigning over his household. They had the idea of absolute control within that realm. I don't know if you caught it, but we get our English word despot from this word. There's a number of words that we get back from the Greek language. When you think of a despot, is it a positive or a negative connotation in your mind? Pretty negative, isn't it? It's interesting, the word really just means one who has full control, one who has full authority. But often, knowing human nature, what happens when man has full control and full authority? He takes it in a negative direction. What's interesting is this word is used 10 times in the New Testament. 6 of those times it's referring to our Lord. So really the broader definition is just one who has total control over his realm. The context is going to determine whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Generally speaking, it's going to refer to one who exercises his authority in a cruel and in an oppressive way. And that brings us to the next point. Not only are we supposed to submit to our masters, we're to submit to our masters regardless of their demeanor, regardless of their character, regardless of the way that they treat me. And I just realized I forgot to turn this microphone on. David, no, it's still there. Are you guys hearing me okay, or should I put the wireless on? I'm going to look at a couple people are we okay, Curtis? Should I turn it on? Okay. I'll stay close, all right? I'll just chalk it up to getting old and lack of sleep. How's that? So we are to submit to our masters, secondly, regardless of their demeanor. You know, there are times where this is going to be easy. There are times this is going to be hard. What does the passage say? Submit to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward. So we've got some options here. That sometimes this is going to be easy. We've all had times in our lives where we worked for a boss that was gentle and kind, where we had a boss over us that was just easy to work for. The words here mean honorable and upright, pleasant, good-natured, agreeable, equitable, fair, all these ideas. It's a joy to work for somebody like that. And by the way, it makes it easy to submit when you have a boss like that. And maybe this would be a good time to say, if you're in a position of authority and leadership in your work environment, strive to be this kind of a boss. Strive to make it easy for those under you to submit and make it a joy for them to work for you. But he goes on to say you need to submit also if they are froward. We don't use that word very much in our version of English, right? We don't use that word a lot. The word means crooked or perverse. A boss that's wicked, a boss that's unfair, a boss that might be surly or unreasonable. All these descriptions. And I think all of us could say, yeah, I've worked for people like that too. Maybe a supervisor, maybe a boss higher up the ladder. And it can be a challenge. The Greek word there is skolios. And we get our word scoliosis from that. What's scoliosis? It's a curvature of the spine, isn't it? I remember as a kid getting tested for scoliosis. Do they still do that? I don't remember if that's part of the normal checkups for kids anymore. But that's the idea. Someone that's crooked. Someone that's disagreeable. But Peter's point is, I realize this is challenging, but you need to submit to your masters, even regardless of their demeanor. But as we think about this a little bit more, I want you to think about the audience that Peter's writing to. We mentioned earlier that there's a twofold audience. He's writing, number one, to Jewish Christians, those that had been pushed out of their homeland through the diaspora. They're now strangers and pilgrims. We saw that in chapter 1. But they're Jewish people. What do we understand about the Jewish mindset? They found it very hard to submit. I think part of it was they felt that their chosen status with God, they were God's chosen people. And I think because of that, they thought that that would exempt them or preclude them from having to submit to other governments and even to other authorities like their masters. Their perspective was, God, we answer to you. Why would I have to answer to any other man? And so we see this attitude. There's one place in particular in the Word of God that we see it. It's in John chapter 8, verse 28. And for sake of time, I'm not going to turn there, but I think it's in your notes. You can look this up and double check me on this. But Jesus is talking, and he said to the Jews which believed on him, if you continue in my word, then are ye my disciples indeed. Great quote. But then he adds this, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. You know the verse. How did the Jewish people respond to him when he made that statement? Well, here's their quote. He said, they answered him and said, we be Abraham's seed, and we were never in bondage to any man. Now, wait a second. Does that make sense to you? I mean, at that point that they made that statement, who were they in bondage to? Rome? Did they forget about Egypt and all the years that they were in captivity in Egypt? Did they forget about all those years during the times of the judges where they were under enemy control? Did they forget about Assyria? I mean, did they lose track of this little thing called Babylon with a 70-year deportation? No, they hadn't forgotten those things. But I think the idea here is, in their minds, even if they were under another authority, they were still free. They still felt like they were Abraham's seed. And maybe this is the idea that in their minds, their attitude was this: you might be able to bind us physically, but you'll never conquer our spirit. In our hearts, we're always free. It's kind of like the little kid that gets in trouble and has to go sit in the corner. And he sits there and he's not happy about it. And so he folds his arms and he gets a scowl on his face and he goes, I might be sitting down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside, right? And we can relate to that. Maybe we can relate a little more than we should. But I think that pictures the mentality of the Jewish people here. They really struggled with this whole thought. And so you can imagine the challenge of a Jewish person in this context being told, you need to submit to your master. You need to submit to your pagan Gentile master. That's tough. That was challenging for them, but that's exactly what Peter is telling them to do. Number 4, as we think about this as well, another challenge in regards to this, they were to submit to their masters despite their new standing in Christ. What's the second audience that Peter's writing to? These Jewish believers, but now also Gentile believers. And they're learning some incredible spiritual truths as they're growing in their walk with God. And Peter is making some of these things clear for them. Hey, we are free. He just said that in the previous passage. Now, we are free in Christ. We have a new identity in Christ. We are a priesthood before God. We answer to God and him alone. And so their mindset could be, well, doesn't that grant us political and social freedom as well? Doesn't that exempt us from submitting to governors and from masters? Maybe they would go on and remember from the writings of Paul in the book of Galatians, where he says, there is neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free. And take these ideas and say, so why do I need to submit to these authorities? And Peter's going to say, yes, all these things are true. These are true on a spiritual level, but we're still in an earthly kingdom. And these spiritual truths do not absolve us from these other human relationships that we are in the middle of here on this earth. Are they true? Absolutely, they're true. But I still have responsibilities to man based on my earthly relationships as well. Oh, and by the way, he also brings us out, you are servants of God. And part of your responsibility and my responsibility as servants of God is submitting to the authorities that he's placed in my life. I submit to him by submitting to those authorities. So these are tough. These are challenges. But there's one other thought that I want to bring out kind of from the social setting of the day. One of the challenges would be submitting to your masters despite their warped perspective. Say, what do you mean by that? Well, Greco-Roman culture had a very distorted perspective on work, on slavery, on human rights. Human rights really were non-existent unless you were a Roman. The system of slavery in that time period affected every single area of society. It was a culture steeped in slavery. From what I've read, there's estimates that there are as many as 60 million slaves in the Roman Empire during this time. Wrap your head around that. 60 million slaves. Where would most of them have come from? Well, in all the conquests that Rome had made, anybody that was still alive, they brought them back and they forced them into slavery, into servitude. So Rome had indeed conquered the world, and here's their mindset. It's kind of interesting. Their perspective was this: what's the point in being masters of this world if I still have to labor and work? I mean, one of the perks of being a master of the world is I shouldn't have to do those things anymore. And so work was seen as something for slaves to do. Citizens should be pampered. They should be allowed to do as they want. They should be given every ease and every comfort imaginable. In addition to that, slaves were considered property. They were purchased at the slave market. They were won in battle. And so they were considered property. They had no legal right. If you had a master that beat you unmercifully and was cruel and vindictive, you couldn't go plead your case with anybody. You were stuck. You were locked into that position. That's tough. That's a difficult place to be. Their mindset was this: a slave is a living tool, just as a tool is an inanimate slave. That's how they viewed the people that were working for them. So imagine being a servant or a slave in that environment. And now Peter comes and says, hey, you need to be submissive to those authorities. That puts a little different rub on it, doesn't it? I don't think I have ever been in a work situation that I could even come close to comparing to that. And I can understand how these people would find themselves challenging this and struggling with this a little bit. I think the majority of people that Peter was writing to, the strangers, the pilgrims that we see in the first chapter, I think the majority of them would find themselves in a position of slavery, in a position of servitude. And despite all these challenges that we've just looked at, Peter's admonition is the same: servants, be in subjection to your masters. Not an easy thing. So how do we accomplish this? Well, he goes on and he gives us a biblical mindset. Did you catch that? I skipped a phrase as we were reading through here. Servants, be subject to your masters. What's the next phrase? With all fear. With all fear. Well, this could mean a couple of different things. Three options that I think are viable here. Number one, the word could mean a cowering fear, where I look at this person and I'm afraid of crossing them. I'm afraid of doing something wrong and making a mistake because I'm going to incur their wrath. I'm going to have their punishment down on top of me. And so I'm cowering in fear. I'm walking on pins and needles. I'm living my life constantly afraid of the repercussions that might come if I make a mistake. Do you think that's what Peter has in mind here? Personally, I don't. And a couple reasons for that. One, look down in chapter 3, verse 14, just in the next chapter. Peter says this: but and if, in other words, when you suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are ye. We'll come back to that later. Be not afraid of their terror, neither be troubled. Don't live your life in this abject fear. Fear can paralyze. Fear can cause all kinds of issues in our lives. And Peter says, don't be afraid at that level. If you go on and look in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7, Paul writes these words: God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. I don't believe what Peter is talking about here is to fear your master in a cowering, paralyzing fear sense of the word. I don't think it's a stretch to say that a child of God does not need to cower in fear to anyone. Now, we need to be respectful. We need to be submissive. We don't need to be arrogant in all of this. But I look at how Peter and John stood before the Sanhedrin. I look at how Paul stood before the Roman government and also the Jewish government there. There was a strong confidence and a strength in what he did. He still acquiesced. He still submitted, but he didn't cower in fear. I think we need to understand that as children of God, we don't have to do that. I don't think that's what Peter has in mind. So there's a couple of other ideas here that it could mean. Secondly, it could mean a healthy respect for their position and for their power. That makes sense. Submit to them with all fear, with all respect, with all honor. Maybe even the idea of reverence here. But with this caveat, we realize that the only reverence we give unconditionally is to God himself. There's a level of reverence that we afford to God and to no man. Fear God, honor the king. We looked at that last week. But that can be part of this idea, a healthier respect for them and their position. But I think a third option here, and I think probably the most probable one, would be a fear of God. Servants, be in submission to your masters in the fear of God. Look back to verse 17. It ties contextually back to that phrase that we just saw at the end of verse 17, fear God and honor the king. Now, fear God and honor your master. Possibly even taking 2 and 3 and combining them together would be the best idea here, a combination of these two. I recognize my God-given authorities. I give them honor and respect. At the same time, I recognize my ultimate authority and give him reverence and awe. I think those two can play well together, and I think they need to. I think that's the idea here. So how do I respond to a boss who may be difficult and challenging and unruly and all these things that we've seen? I do it in the fear of God. I do it with respect for his authority. I honor that individual, but I fear God at the same time. I look at that authority and I'm honoring this relationship, but I'm looking over his head to the one that he ultimately submits to as well, and that's God. And so I'm honoring God, I'm submitting to God, and consequently submitting to the one that's underneath him. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the message that there are some things in this passage that may not apply to us completely. We're not in slave-master relationships. Some of that we're going to see here in verse 19 and verse 20. But let me just make a couple of comments here in regards to us and our workday environments. I've listed several passages for you here in your notes, and I would encourage you to take those home and look those up on your own. We don't have time to delve into that. But it helps you understand a biblical perspective of work and what God has in mind for us in our work environments. And let me just share a couple thoughts here quickly, and then we'll go on to the next point and finish up our message. Number one, work is a good thing. Say, really? Yeah, work is a good thing. Work is part of God's plan. I've had people say, well, Pastor Mark, work is just a result of the curse. No, it's not. God gave responsibilities to man before the curse ever took place. The curse made work more difficult, I'll grant you that, but work was part of God's plan from the very beginning. We find a satisfaction in working. God created us to create and to work and to do things that way. So work is a good thing. God commands us to work. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 says if a person that doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. That seems like a harsh phrase, and it's talking about those that are able to work. And if you're lazy and you choose not to, the motivation to eat should motivate you to work, is what Paul is saying. But you know what? Work is also going to be a part of heaven. We are going to labor. We are going to serve. We are going to work throughout all eternity. It's going to be a joyful service as we're working for the best boss or master you could ever imagine. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but someday we'll find out. So work is a good thing. Number two, be a diligent worker. Several of these passages that I've given you in the notes there remind us of that. Work hard. Be diligent in your effort. Put your heart into it. You may not be the best worker, the best construction worker, the best cook, the best whatever in the company you're working for, but you should be one of the hardest working. And you should work to the best of your ability. Right? And I think that's what he's talking about here. Be diligent. Third, be an obedient worker. Listen when your boss gives you instructions. Follow those instructions. We see that in a couple of those passages. Listen and follow the instruction that your boss gives you. Number four, be an honest worker. Be an honest worker, trustworthy. One of the passages, I think it's Colossians, says, work as hard when your boss is watching as you do when he's not watching. That's honesty. That's integrity. We all know what it's like when the boss leaves the floor, when he leaves the shift, when he goes home, whatever. Boy, it kind of deteriorates a little bit, or it can. And he says, don't be that way. How many of you have ever watched an episode of Undercover Boss? It's a show that's been on for a while back. Some of you are nodding your heads. The point of the show is a CEO of a company disguises himself or herself, and then he goes and works within that company in different low, menial, lower level positions just to kind of see what's going on. And boy, they find out all kinds of things that they probably didn't want to know at that point, right? Hey, a Christian should be a hard worker, should be an honest worker, whether the boss is watching or whether he's not. Then I would say, number five, kind of similar, be a sincere worker. Give your best. But it's from the perspective of I'm serving the Lord. When I'm working for this earthly boss, I'm really working for my heavenly Father. And so my work should be done in that way. I'm cooking a meal, I'm doing it as if God was going to be the one eating it. If I'm building a house, I'm building it in such a way that I would be happy if God came to live there. You understand the analogy. You understand what I'm saying. The thought crossed my mind as I'm preparing messages to prepare it in such a way that if God were sitting right here on the third row, I wouldn't be embarrassed or disappointed. By the way, God is here. I don't know what row he's in. He's spirit, but he is here because I know there's more than three of us here that are here gathered in his name. And he's promised to be here with us. That's a comfort. But it's a challenge for me to continue to do my best as well as I work through this. It's not just for you, this is for me also. So yes, we're working for wages, and yes, we're working to please our boss, and yes, maybe we're working to advance the company and do whatever we can do that way, but ultimately, we're working for God. And we need to keep that in mind. Anything and everything we do should be of high enough quality that I could present it to my God without shame or without embarrassment. Work as though you're working for God. So some practical thoughts. Look those verses up, especially if you're still in your work environment, and develop your own list based on those as far as how you believe God wants you to work. Bottom line is this: it's God's desire, it's His expectation that Christians, workers, respectfully submit to their bosses, that they work in such a way that they demonstrate a beautiful life to their unsaved co-workers and the unsaved bosses that they may have in their lives. So number one, submissive servants fulfill God's expectation. Number two, and this might be a little harder, submissive suffering wins God's favor. In the midst of my work environment, there may be suffering that comes my way. Notice verse 19, for this is thankworthy, if a man for conscience towards God endure grief, suffering wrongfully. For what glory is it when you be buffeted for your faults, you shall take it patiently. But if when you do well and suffer for it, you take it patiently, this is acceptable unto God. God reserves a special favor or blessing for those who suffer while submitting to authority. Wouldn't it be nice if Christianity could eradicate all suffering in all relationships? It'd be a wonderful thing. It will happen someday when Jesus Christ comes to rule and to reign, but it's not going to happen until that point. And so the bottom line is we are going to endure suffering as we go through this life. And we are to do it with patience. He says that twice there in verse 20. Take it patiently. At the end of the verse, take it patiently. So we are to endure suffering with patience, and he paints three scenarios for us here in this text. First of all, you might endure suffering for doing right. What does he say there at verse 19? It's for conscience towards God. For conscience sake. And he goes on to say that this is suffering, it's grief, it's difficulty, but it's undeserved. The suffering that this person is enduring, he's enduring it wrongfully, unjustly, unfairly. He didn't do anything to deserve it. But what did he do that brought on this suffering? Well, the suffering came from doing right. It came for conscience sake. In the conscientious discharge of his duties, he finds he cannot honor a specific command because doing so would violate his conscience, and so he chooses not to obey that command. And because of that, he's incurred suffering. He's acted according to his conscience before God. It'd be interesting to have a discussion on this at some point. Have any of you ever found yourself in a work situation where you had to make a choice between obeying my boss or obeying God? I have to either follow my conscience or I have to do what the boss told me to do. I bet we could think of situations where that's happened to us. It wouldn't take a lot of imagination to come up with scenarios for these Jewish and Gentile believers in the first century to realize that could happen for them. You're a servant within a household. Maybe you're even a favored servant. Maybe you're a good relationship with your boss. And now the boss wants to include you in a family celebration where they're worshiping an idol. Wow, what do you do in that situation? That'd be difficult, wouldn't it? Maybe there's some immorality or some in the pagan festivals that they're in the middle of, and now you've got to make a choice. Am I going to be involved in this, or am I going to choose not to? It's not a stretch to think that could happen to us as well. Maybe you're in an office setting and the phone rings, and just as you go to answer it, your boss pokes his head around the corner and he says, "Tell him I'm not here." How do you respond to that situation? Are you willing to lie for your boss? I think I might be saying, well, if you want me to say that, you better get out the door in a hurry, right? If you want me to say that, you better go. I'm willing to say he can't come to the phone right now, but I'm not going to lie and say, I'm sorry, he's not here. You see what I'm saying? And there's lots of ways that could come up. Maybe you're asked to fudge some numbers on a financial report or to sign off on something that really wasn't done or wasn't done properly. There's a number of ways this could happen. Maybe in a construction type scenario, you're asked to do something and you know it's not up to code. But the boss says, we just got to get this done because we've got a deadline to meet. How do we respond in those situations? Well, I think that there's a time when we have to step out of rank, where we have to tell our boss with humility, with respect, I'm sorry, I cannot do that. That violates my conscience. But when that happens, we need to also be prepared for the suffering that might come. So that's the first scenario, a suffering that might come for conscience sake. Secondly, when suffering comes for doing wrong. This is interesting. We don't often think about this, but Peter brings it up. He says, what glory is it when you be buffeted for your faults? When you messed up, when you did something in the work environment and you made a mistake, It's interesting. It's the word for sin. And it's important to understand that a lot of these Greek words were words long before the Bible came along, and we see them in a theological sense. But the word hamartano just means to miss the mark, to shoot an arrow at a target and miss the target. And so the thought here is in your workday, you blew it. You did something that was wrong. And all of us can think of times when that's happened for us. Our work fell short of expectations. And man, I could give you all kinds of examples of things in my life where I've been in situations like that. I worked in the kitchen at college, and why they put me in the kitchen, I don't know. Started as a dishwasher, worked my way into being a cook, supper cook, and that year I was responsible for the pasta bar or potato bar every night. And so, it was a day, I don't remember what my mind was on, but I came in and I was focused on whatever, and I was supposed to make this big old pot of spaghetti sauce, and so I had my recipe in front of me, and I kind of looked it over, went back to the shelf where all the number 10 cans are, and grabbed 2 big old number 10 cans of what I thought was tomato sauce, and brought that back out, and I poured that in the pot, all the seasonings, got it all mixed up, added the meat, and it was good sauce, normally. Then I tasted it, and it was horrible. It was the worst tasting sauce I'd ever tasted in my life. And I looked at the cans that I'd opened. They weren't tomato sauce. They were ketchup. Can you salvage a pasta sauce made with ketchup? Robbie's a chef. He might be able to figure out a way. I tried. I did everything I could to doctor that up, and it was the worst spaghetti sauce in the world. We still had to serve it that night, unfortunately, because we didn't have time to make more. And guess what happened after that was done? We threw it out. I cost them some money that day. I blew it. It was a mistake on my part. That's a small example. I have other examples from my work history where there was more money involved. One particular time I was bending countertops. We had a post-form machine, and your laminate countertops, they've got that bend in the back for the backsplash. And we had a machine that would do that, and it was time sensitive. You were heating that laminate up to the point just right where it would bend and not break, but you had to also be fast enough so you didn't put a burn mark in the laminate, especially if it was a lighter colored laminate. And one day I ended up having a white countertop, and I didn't get it done quite in time. And when I flipped it over and put it on my bench, I could see that white countertop in the cove looked like toasted marshmallow. It was brown. And my boss came around, and he found out about that, and he hit the ceiling. I didn't know it at the time. It was a special order job. And they had ordered the laminate in special. It was the most expensive coating on the laminate that you could get. Everything was against it. And so now they had to go and not only order new laminate, they had to overnight it to get it there. I cost the company some money. And I heard about it. I knew my boss was fluent in English. I didn't know he was fluent in French. He was bilingual, and I heard some things that day that I never had heard before. And it was justified, though. I had made a mistake. I cost them money. And it's interesting in the passage, Peter says, what glory is it if you be buffeted for your faults? Now we're back to the slave relationship here. Buffeted, it's just what you think. It's from the word for fist. It means to strike a blow. And in that society, if you messed up, if you did something wrong, you could be beaten for it. Peter's not justifying that. But in today's society, if I do something wrong, if I mess up in a work-type situation, I shouldn't be surprised if there's suffering that comes because of it. There could be consequences because of that. But he goes on and gives us a third scenario here, and he says, when the suffering is for doing well. And that's what we see at the end of verse 20. If when you do well and suffer for it, you take it patiently, this is acceptable to God. I don't know how to paint this any differently, but you're being a good worker. You're showing up on time. You're doing your job. You're going above and beyond. You're bringing money in for the company. You're doing everything you're supposed to do and more. And then maybe somebody who doesn't like you starts spreading a rumor. Maybe you get blamed for something you didn't do. Maybe somebody else takes credit for what you did. But somehow in the course of this relationship, you are now suffering, and you did well. You did well. There's no reason for you to be suffering in this time. And what Peter is saying here is you need to extend grace, and you need to take it patiently at the same time. It's one thing to endure reproof or suffering when we know it's deserved. It takes real grace to accept undeserved blame and to do it without anger or complaint. And that's what Peter's trying to get across here. So regardless of what scenario you find yourself in, where you're suffering for a conscious decision that you had to make, whether you're suffering for doing something that's wrong, or maybe you're suffering undeservedly for something that you did that's right, the admonition is to do your best to take it patiently. Why? What does he say? Why do this? Here's the final point. This kind of suffering finds favor with God. This kind of suffering finds favor with God. Look at verse 19. It says, this is thankworthy. Go down to the end of verse 20. He says, this is acceptable. Those two phrases are almost identical in the Greek, and the word that he uses is grace. You're going to have to think about this a little bit. I struggled trying to think, how do I put this into a way that's understandable for us? But I think the best understanding I can come to is that in this situation, we will find favor with God. He will look upon my suffering with favor. It will meet with his approval, and he will bless and reward me in the midst of it. That's the idea of thankworthy there in that first verse. There will be thanks that is given for that. You know, folks, we may be temporarily mistreated by an earthly boss, but at the same time, we'll be eternally rewarded by our heavenly master. And that's something that we can keep in mind in those situations. There is no perfect system. If you're in the work environment, at some point, you're going to experience suffering. You're going to experience difficulty. And in those times, we need to submit to those authorities. We need to do it patiently. We need to do it with humility, remembering that God is going to reward me, and he's going to give me his blessing and his favor in the midst of that time. There's about 20 more minutes worth in my message here that I'm not going to get to. Let me just share a third thought here, and we're going to just close with this. There's a third point that we see, and we're just going to mention it. He talks about suffering and the difficulty that comes with that. In verse 21, he says, for even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow in his steps. Folks, did Jesus Christ endure suffering, unjust suffering, while he was on this earth? Absolutely. And so he's saying, in your relationships, you may experience that same kind of suffering. Follow my example. Not that God condones those times of suffering. I think as we work through here, we'll be able to apply this not just to the servant-master relationships, but to every submission relationship that we see here in this context. And I think it'll be a great encouragement for us as we come back to this, not next week, but the week after that. So how are we doing in our work relationships? How are we handling these times of difficulty and these times of suffering? Do we find it difficult or easy to submit to our boss? That's what God would call us to do. And I would also say to you out there that are bosses, aspire to be the kind of leader that makes it easy for those underneath you to submit. Be submissive. If you're on the lower end, be a good boss that encourages that submission and makes it easy if you're on the upper side. Regardless, servants, be subject to your masters. Father,